that happens on Sunday a lot too. I don't think this one's in. Pull that stand way down. Just push it way down, that'll do it. And this one too, I think. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you for your attention and for coming this evening. I'm here on behalf of our book club here at Grace, which is going to be reading Dave's book, and we all know Dave very well. Actually, I'm just going to tell a few things about him when one of his friends is actually going to introduce him. But many of you I know him already. Feel free to get up and get snacks and coffee or water anytime you want to, okay? Dave's a longtime resident of Arizona, and I think most of you know that. But he was born in Iowa. He grew up in South Dakota. He spent many years in Michigan, and he's also lived in Missouri and California. We like to think that Arizona is his favorite state, and well, it obviously is because he loves the Grand Canyon, right? You probably maybe know him either, if you're here, you know him as a naturalist or as an elementary school teacher. Prior to that, he was a communications director, and a long time ago, and this is from his sister, so I know it's true. A long time ago, he drove a flower delivery truck and also an egg truck. So that's true. Came right from his sister's mouth, okay? He has a very interested and varied past, obviously. We here at Grace know him as a selfless servant of God, kind usher who always has a warm welcome for us every Sunday. So I'm going to introduce Kim Warner, who knows him through the Tortolita Preserve, and I'm going to ask Kim to come up, and he's got more information about Dave before we let Dave go on. So, Kim?
I'm not so sure, but I think everything that I was going to say has already been said. She left out the fact, Dave and I went to the same high school in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. We were Washington Warriors. Of course, we didn't know each other at that time. We come from, our classes at that time were over 600 kids in a class. And so it was really easy to only know a small handful. And of course, Dave was an upperclassman, which meant in my eyes, he was somebody special. And I always have strived to be as special as those upper class people, and I've yet to achieve it. I'm never going to forgive you for that, Dave. Dave and I we've met through trails and a love for the Sonoran Desert, I think, as we could say. Dave is a master naturalist, was already pointed out. And following COVID, the master naturalists were wondering what they were going to do for their future gig, because everything that they had been doing involved groups, and groups were kind of disappearing. And so I work for the town of Marana Parks and Rec, and once a month through 7 months of the year, those tolerable months, we do a free guided hike in the Tortolita Mountains. And, pardon? That are our big months, yes. No, from September, and then actually in September we do a night hike to try to beat the heat, and through April. And then in June we do another night hike. And Dave has accompanied us on all of those, and they give the gist of the natural world, and I'm kind of there to fill in the color commentary. But it's, and well, we have been lucky enough to see snakes a couple of times, and they were always cooperative. They stayed coiled off the trail, allowed everybody to get a picture, and then after everybody got a picture, they crawl off into the desert, just like they're supposed to do. So, and as was mentioned, he's an educator. He's an amateur archaeologist. He's a master naturalist, and he's quite an adventurer. And anybody here that has read his book, I've been fortunate enough, I read the first edition, and then because he asked me to do this, I thought, well, I better read the second edition and see what he changed. And there's a few changes, but not big, but it was a good enough book, I read it twice. So going into the Grand Canyon is something I've probably fantasized about a lot in my youth. I have been fortunate enough to camp on the upper edge of it a couple of times, but never like Dave has done. After reading it the first time, I thought my criticism of Dave was that he didn't truly enjoy it. And then I read it the second time and realized, wait, every day he had 10 hours of daylight when he wasn't hiking to actually enjoy where he was at. So I think he's going to do a great job presenting some of that to us tonight. And with that, it's Dave DeGroot.
Thank you, Kim.
You bet, Dave.
Okay.
Dave, what's with the badge?
Okay. Strange you should ask. The badge. Okay. That's the Master Naturalist badge, and when I'm out with Kim and Jason and Tina in the mountains, this is where Master Naturalist, and Dan Collins, many of you know. And the shirt, that's kind of my own invention. When you walk up to a bunch of people that are going to be hiking, and you're dressed like this, they all kind of look at you and do whatever you say. So that's the whole reason for the shirt. So I thought I'd wear it tonight. I should just mention, Kim, who just introduced me, just recently won Best of the Best award on the state level from the Arizona Parks and Recreation Association for Outstanding Park Professional. So congratulations, Kim. And also, I haven't circulated here. A couple of people, let's see, is Mark Johnson here? Jay Grodman, I'd like to mention Jay, Marana Parks and Rec, raising his hand over there. Done an outstanding job. My personal motto, as you'll see when I'm talking, is caretakers, being caretakers. And Jay just exemplifies that with the Tortolita Preserve. Okay, and thank you to the Women's Book Club, too. Also Deb, who you met, and the other women, and my sister Ruth at the back table, who was my #1 editor. And all mistakes in the book are on me, not her, because she tried to get rid of them all. And you'll meet Louis, my brother-in-law, at the table during the presentation. Okay, I'm going to set my timer. This is going to be a fun presentation, not an academic speech. I'm going to set my timer for 45 minutes. And when the timer goes off, it makes a really nasty sound. It isn't. I thought I'd get a bell that would ding, but you'll hear it. When the timer goes off, that means I'm going to start wrapping it up. And it's set for 45 minutes, and then I'll start wrapping it up. And then at the end, there'll be time for a few questions, if you have any questions at the end. Next slide, Robert. And I'll cue Robert on the slides. That's the easiest way to advance the slides. How did I get interested in the Grand Canyon? Well, real quickly, it was the South Dakota Badlands. And yes, I'm a little unbalanced about the Grand Canyon. Going back all the times I did and going as deep into the canyon and all that, you have to be a little bit abnormal. And yes, I guess I am. Started in the Badlands. My family used to go to the Black Hills and stop at the Badlands, and that's where I had my first encounter with rattlesnakes, lizards, and cactuses, and I loved it. And it imprinted as a very tender young age. Next, please, Robert. Then we used to get the National Geographic magazine, and I very clearly remember this picture when I was 7 or 8 years old. I didn't know what in the world this picture was. I had to take it to my mom and ask what and I found the picture later. Had to ask my mother, what is this stuff down below? Is this like the Badlands? And her answer was, no, it's bigger. It's about 100 times bigger. And for my little 7-year-old mind, that was just off the charts. And one more thing about why I'm interested in the Grand Canyon. Next slide, please, Robert. 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Had in Vermilion, South Dakota, read us Brighty of the Grand Canyon, this little donkey that could, and again, my 4th grade mind just could hardly comprehend this little donkey starting out in hot weather along the Colorado River, going up this trail, and in 7 or 8 hours he could be in snowstorms. And you know, in South Dakota, we had to wait through the whole summer months before we'd get from the hot to the cold, but Brighty could do it in 6 hours. So that's the imprint that on my young mind. Next, please, Robert. And I was trained as a journalist, so personally, and then leading hikes, I would research a trail before the hike, so I knew what we were getting into. As a group leader, it's incumbent on you to know what you're getting into. And then during our hikes, once or twice a year for 35 years, during our hikes, taking notes on what we were seeing, and then at the end, going back and doing a little more research on what we had seen, and putting that all together in a bunch of, I'd almost call them newspaper articles or magazine articles. I kept them all over the years, and those gave me the facts to help recall a lot of these adventures. Next, please, Robert. So I'm calling this speech The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's a kind of a catchy phrase. And indeed, there were some bad and ugly and mixed in with the good. But that's not a good progression for a speech. So I'll start with the bad, and then I'll go into a couple of ugly, and then I'll wind up with the good. So you're all in a good mood as you leave. Okay, Robert. These are the trails that I call them my trails. These are all the maintained and unmaintained trails in Grand Canyon National Park. Number 1 on the far edge is the Havasupai tribal land. And that's not technically in the Grand Canyon, of course, but when hikers get together, they usually talk about the Havasu Canyon hike as the far west of the main trail system. The far right, number 16, is the Tanner Trail that I'll talk about a little bit. And so I've covered all these, some of them multiple times, some of them once or twice, but these are the trails covered in the book. And I'll talk about a few of them tonight. Okay, next, please. Bad stuff, but not too bad. We'll start with bad stuff, but not too bad. I don't want to shock you at the beginning. Actually, kind of fun. Next slide, Robert. Ravens. Learned over 35 years, ravens can pass along intelligence. They can pass along stories to other ravens. It's almost like they go to Raven Night School. 35 years ago, ravens would fly down into a campsite after you left and try to scavenge the food. Now, over the years, they learned that backpacks contain food. They learned if they can get their beak into a backpack and pull something out, it might be food. And then years later, they started learning about zippers. A raven can now swoop in and unzip a backpack, and they've learned that a foil package without an odor often is food. So they'll be very happy to fly down into a campsite when you're not looking, unzip your backpack and pull out your food. And this is the sign that the rangers have put up at the bottom of the Grand Canyon right now. Ravens will attack your backpacks and steal your food. Not only that, but they'll go for car fobs. And the rangers will also tell you credit cards. So if any of you go down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, you see some ravens in the vicinity, don't leave your credit cards out. I don't know what bank they take them to. But okay, next slide. Our friend Bill Moberg, who's sitting here, there he is. He's not bashful about admitting it. Yeah, he had an experience with ravens too. He had all his gear out along the Colorado River. Raven swooped in, stole his only roll of toilet paper, and what did the raven do with it? Dropped it in the middle of the Colorado River. Okay. And went flying away. Next slide, Robert. Okay, another dangerous animal. And the rangers will be quick to tell you this. Some of you know this. The cute little thing, rock squirrels. About this big, cutest little thing ever. And they're not dangerous because they're ferocious and they attack you. What happens is you don't want them to bite you or nip you, and you don't even want them to get close to you. So even if they come into your campsite putting on all their little cuteness act, which they can really do well to beg, don't feed them and don't let them get near, because as a ranger said, if they even nip you and you go to a doctor who's proactive, you can run up a medical bill of hundreds of dollars or even more than 1,000. Robert, next slide. I know you can't read all this, but I wanted you to get an idea of the different diseases that can come from this cute little animal. I'll just read the headings here. Lice, fly larvae, mites, ticks, fleas, bubonic plague coming off the fleas. That's Black Death. Tularemia, also called rabbit fever, which sometimes transfers to humans. Brucellosis, you've probably heard of that in relation to cows and deers. And that's a bad one that sometimes goes to humans. And Rocky Mountain spotted fever, or Rocky Mountain spotted tick fever, as we used to call it. All that from the cute little, so keep your distance if you see them, and for sure don't feed them. Next slide, please, Robert. Okay, bad stuff, not quite so much fun. And I want to get into water math here in a minute. I'll explain what I mean. Next slide, Robert. Was with 3 very tough hikers, 2 guys, my son-in-law Patrick on the right, he'd just gotten out of the Navy, and Tovin Adams to the left. Patrick was as he called himself, a dirt sailor in Afghanistan, and Tovin was a swabby, I guess, on the boats on the ocean. Just got out, tough guys. It was a good thing they were tough and capable guys. We needed all the toughness we could get on this hike. Next slide. Our goal was to go 2 days down and 2 days up off the Hermit Rest on the Hermit Trail. And halfway down we would get water, and we would view this Grand Canyon landmark, Monument Rock. And the rangers assured us that there would be water, a source of water, once we got halfway down to this landmark. So that was our goal. The first day, next slide, please. And if you haven't been to Hermit's Rest, this just gives you an idea of where we started the hike. Grand Canyon Village, and then you go west along the West Rim Trail or the shuttle bus, and then you go over the edge at the Hermit Trail trailhead, and then down for 4 days. Next slide. Water math. Some of you have been in the Grand Canyon, and I know, let's have a show of hands a minute. How many of you have been at least a day or 2? Yeah, look at that. You understand about water. If you have been in the Grand Canyon, water is everything. You do not mess around with water. However, you got to be a little careful on an extended hike, especially a waterless trail. A quart of water weighs 2 pounds. On a long hike, you can easily be packing 12 or 14 pounds of water in your backpack just to get down to your water source, or even more sometimes. And that could easily equal a third of your whole pack weight. And unless you've carried a 35-pound pack any distance, it doesn't sound like much, but after a few, Martin, after a few hours, you know it. It gets to be a heavy load. Next slide. So we did to get to Monument Rock, we did the water math, and we were very conservative. We were very careful. I'm representing it here with my carpenter's tape measure. Trailhead, and we carefully plotted out the amount of water it would take, and I'm using the carpenter's measuring device as the Monument Rock. So we had plenty of water to make it. We even had an emergency quart, and we had an extra quart for food. So we went over the edge that way, ready to go. Next slide. And we knew we would run out of water. We knew we would pass the point of return, past the point of no return, about 2/3 of the way down. That's a prudent hiker, that happens. In other words, what that means is you don't have enough water to go back up to your starting point anymore. You're committed. You got to get to your end of your hike. So went pretty well. Down we went. Next slide, Robert. And our hike suddenly changed. The phrase we used was Tovin blew out his knee about 2/3 of the way down, and it was pretty bad. Tovin, as tough as he was reduced to kind of hobbling with one bad leg and one good leg. So Patrick and I each took a little bit of weight out of his pack, but he didn't want to get rid of all his weight. you know, 3 guys get together and you want to hold up your end. Well, that was Tobin. But as we hiked slower and slower, we were still using water, and a whole nature of our hike changed. We only had enough water to get to the orange tape measure device. We didn't have water to go past that. Next slide. We had passed much earlier than we expected. We had passed the point of no return. We did not have enough water to go back, and we didn't have enough water to go all the way forward. Next slide. What kept us going was the promise of the ranger that there would be water at Monument Rock. So we kept going with our short supply of water. Next slide. Well, it got to be dark. We were not only hiking past our water supply, but we were hiking past daylight. This is Monument Rock as we saw it at 11 o'clock at night with our headlamps. And then we started looking around for the water. Could not find the water. It was pitch dark, no moon, no clouds, no starlight. So we looked for the water, couldn't find it. And then I made the decision as the group leader, guys, we're not going to find it tonight. None of the options look good, so what we're going to do is put up our tents right here on the trail. And tomorrow morning at daybreak, we'll go out and hopefully find the water the ranger promised us was here. And we did believe the ranger. So in the middle of the night, Robert, this was the situation. Okay, boys, we're going to sleep right here and just hope and pray that tomorrow morning when the sun comes up, we do find the water. And I'll never forget that feeling of draining the last couple drops from the canteen and being in the middle of the Grand Canyon. Which leads to a little talk about water. And those of you who've done some hiking understand purifying water. Next slide. How do you get water out of a seep or a pothole or a little creek in the Grand Canyon that might have frogs and bugs in it and pond scum on the top? Next slide. Well, what I did was go to my brother-in-law, Louis Marshall. Some of you know Louis, sitting at the back table there. Louis has been going down to Guatemala for 25 years now, once a year, and installing and maintaining water purification systems in Guatemala next to Lake Atitlan, where all the water is polluted, seriously polluted. Now, Louis' job is to go down with filtration devices, and Louis, he told me, and this is what it is. He said, I can make the water 99.999% pure. So I asked Louis, how can a backpacker do that? And he, next slide, Robert. And Louis introduced me to a standard item at REI, which is a ceramic water purification filtration system. You pump the water out of the pothole or the seep, goes through the ceramics and charcoal, and then it comes out clean on the bottom. Well, that's a great demonstration for kids. Next slide. Phoenix, I just did a presentation a couple months ago, hiking in the Grand. These kids in this class were about to do a field trip to the South Rim. So I demonstrated, I call it Louis' water purifier, which is on the table there. So the kids go out, and you understand, this was 6th graders. You understand how the mind of a 6th grader works. So they brought in sand off the playground, dirt off the flower garden outside the school. Somebody had hot sauce in their lunch, salt, pepper, everything they could think of into the water. And then I would get out the pump purifier, and next slide. As you could see, every eye in the place was on me. They couldn't even stay in their seats. So I'd pump it, and the pure water would come out, and then you make a big deal of it. I hope, I don't drop down dead after drinking this, kids. And then it comes out crystal clear, Louis. Same pump purifier I've been using for 25 years is still working beautifully. Next slide. Okay, let me shift a little bit. Bad stuff, but however, this is stuff that's not quite so much fun. And it's hot down there. Any way you cut it, it's hot down in the Grand Canyon, especially sometimes during the spring and sometimes during the fall months when you think it should be cool and it's not. Next slide. So I came up with the brilliant idea. No, it was a good idea. I was going to go in the Bright Angel Trailhead, down, and this would be a solo hike. I usually would hike with a group, but this one I was going to do on my own. Solo hike across the Tonto Plateau and then out at Hermit's Rest. Hermit's Rest, as the crow flies, is about 9 miles from the Bright Angel Trailhead. Well, it's not 9 miles as the hiker walks across the plateau. It's 24 miles because of all the ins and outs. You go in for drainages and ravines and cliffs, you go around, so it equals up to 24. Well, I was ready for that. I had water. I thought I was drinking water pretty well. Next slide. The rangers warned me, and I knew this in my head, but maybe not in my heart. They said 108 degrees, that's what the forecast is for today. That temperature is taken in the shade, and that's like 120 in the sun. And I'm young and tough. This was years ago, and I'm thinking, I live in Tucson. I can do 108. That's not, what's that to a Tucsonan, 108? But the difference is, if you're in the full blast of sunlight, 120, it's a little different in the Grand Canyon because, for two reasons, you can't get out of it. In Tucson, we get into our air conditioner cars or we go from one building to another, but you don't get out of it. And plus, the sunlight has a way of bouncing off the cliff walls and like a solar furnace, and that 120 is truly 120. So on I go on the Tonto Trail, and I have to admit, I was getting a little sweaty. This is all years ago. I have to remember some of these. Getting a little sweaty, getting just a little bit of a headache, not bad, and also a little bit dizzy maybe, not too bad. And I'm tough. I'm from Tucson. I know 108 degrees, so I just kept going until, next slide. Next slide will be in the until. This gives you an idea of some of the land on the Tonto Plateau. That's my tent. The name of this cliff face, the whole arrangement of cliffs here is the Inferno, which gives you an idea. Okay, now the next slide. So here I go hiking around the corner of the rocks, feeling these little things. And I turn to my left, and in a grotto in the rock faces was a rhesus monkey. Now, I've done a little travel in India, and I know what a rhesus monkey is. They used to hang around outside my hotel rooms. And he was watching me with his eyes, about so tall. I could see the fur ruffling in the breeze. His tail was twitching. And I had just enough brain power left to think, Dave, this is not good. This is truly not good. So what I did, I'm so thankful I had enough sense left. I put my tent fly over some bushes for shade, laid down in the shade, doused myself with water, drank some more water, and actually took a short nap. Next slide. So those of you who are doing hot weather hiking, I see a lot of seniors in the audience. You maybe know all this, but I'm still learning this. Even as late as last Saturday, still learning. Heat exhaustion can come at you from different ways. It's not always the same. It's not always sweating. It's not always muscle cramps or weakness or dizziness. It can be something. It can be one of those symptoms one time and another symptom another time. And you want to immediately take steps, because if it goes into heat stroke, that's the bad one. That can kill you. And next slide, please. Okay, let's move along. Worse than ugly.
You clearly survived both.
Yeah. However, thank you for bringing that up, Jim. If you want to read the rest of the story, buy my book. No. Although, yeah. Although, if you ask me a question after the speech, I will tell you the rest of the story on some of those. Okay, a couple of worse than ugly stories, and then into the good stuff. Next slide, please, Robert. This is worse than ugly in my judgment because it involves the whole Grand Canyon and one of the best trails in any national park anywhere, the Bright Angel Trail. Several years before the Grand Canyon became a national park, State Senator Ralph Cameron, he's the guy that the town of Cameron was named after, northern Arizona, got mining claims up and down the Bright Angel Trail, and he figured he owned the trail. Basically, he did. And he wanted to make it into a toll road. And he put his money where his mouth, or he made other people put their money where his mouth was. He put up a toll gate, charged $1 a head. This is back in the 19-teens. $1 a head to go down the Bright Angel Trail, $1 for a mount, $1 for the restroom, $1 for snacks, $1 for water at the bottom. He nickel and dime people to death, and he thought that was his right. And once the Grand Canyon became federal land, a national park, he still wasn't getting out. He still fought it in court. He figured that was his personal fiefdom to his money-making machine. And finally, his voters, it was his voters in northern Arizona that voted him out. And he finally was out of it, and the national park took over the Bright Angel Trail. Next slide. Some of you who were at the Grand Canyon maybe in the 70s remember this. Over Maricopa Point, if you stood at Grand Canyon Village, that would be off to the far left. The mine header, this was a uranium mine on the edge of the Grand Canyon, a deep shaft, a vertical shaft, pulling up uranium for the Cold War. And there was a lot of uranium coming out of this mine, and they needed to make hundreds of nuclear warheads at the time, so the mine served a function. And then came the 1980s. This is while it was a national park. Then came the 1980s, and the need for uranium, as you may recall, when they started decommissioning the nuclear devices, went way down. And it wasn't profitable anymore. So the National Park Service went to the mine operators and said, hey, uranium isn't nearly as profitable anymore. Can we buy you out, or can we make a deal with you or something? We'd like to have the mine revert back to the natural landscape. And in their audacity, the next slide shows you what the mine operators proposed. They said, we'll get rid of our uranium mine if you allow us to build this on our property, a multi-level hotel going over the edge of Maricopa Point, a swimming pool with a cabana on Tonto Platform, skyboxes, bars, restrooms, restaurants, parking, everything. And that was, there's a word, I had to look up the meaning of the word, egregious. So egregious that they pretty much said, you're out of here. And the state legislature and the feds, everybody made sure that they exited. However, the story wasn't quite over. And some of you know what happens when mine operators exit. Next slide. There is now a creek flowing out of the cliffs below where the mine was. It's called Horn Creek. And there's been different generations of this sign posted along Horn Creek. So you're walking across the Tonto Plateau, and you get to, there's a beautiful little creek, no fish, no tadpoles, nothing in it. And you read that this is contaminated water. It's a radioactive creek because of the spillage coming out of the old mine and now flowing in the Horn Creek across the plateau. And this isn't a religious talk, but so the first time I saw this sign, my gesture in my hands was kind of like this. Come on, this beautiful little creek. And now, how long does radiation pollution last? Yeah, hundreds of years, thousands of years, and that's what's happened to the creek here. So the one religious theme slide is Jesus Christ backpacking on the Tonto Plateau with his backpack. Okay, next slide. And coming up to the sign and just trying to express with this kind of a gesture, and I'll say this reverently, my God, what have you done to this beautiful little creek, you know? Next slide. Okay, time to shift to some good stuff. I'll talk about some specific trails. And my timing is 20 minutes left before the timer goes off. That's about right. Okay, next slide, please, Robert. In August, last August 8, you may remember there's a big hoopla in the news about new national monument land created around the Grand Canyon. The light green shaded, is where the national monument land is now. It was just, my grandson and I were up there, Wyatt and I were camping about the time it was made into a national monument land. And there's a new level of protection for this land. And when you add to it the Navajo, excuse my shaky hands, I had a little dehydration episode last weekend, and I'm still not quite over it, and I'm left with the shakes. But the Navajo land on the east, Havasupai land on the west. So now the Grand Canyon is ringed by either land that's restricted or sovereign nations who care deeply about the land. And it's not just the land. Next slide, Robert. Under the land, and they didn't make a big deal of this in the newspaper reports, but and the tribal people absolutely are thinking about the aquifers under the land, and it's the aquifers that feed these best waterfalls in the world. If any of you have seen them, I see some nodding heads. Deer Creek Falls on the left, I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Any of you rafted in the Grand Canyon? Do you recall? Yeah. Many rafters, when they pull up on the beach by Deer Creek, recall that as one of the best stops of the raft trip. That's how beautiful the falls is. Havasu Falls, this was just a picture I snapped with my iPhone going down, and you can't help but get a National Geographic quality photo, just hanging your iPhone over the edge and taking a picture. Navajo Falls, that, by the way, is Norm Crawford. Some of you may remember Norm doing a waterfall jump off the top of Navajo Falls. It's one of his daughters down below. So these falls come out of aquifers. And even though which is getting to be more and more important as the years pass, these are underground storage vaults of pristine water. And the idea of somebody not being careful up above and letting stuff seep into the aquifers would just be deadly for the aquifers. So that's an important thing to note about this new national monument. Next slide. North Kaibab Trail. We'll get into a little bit of history here. Anybody been on the North Kaibab Trail? Yeah, okay. Peterson's again. Okay. A little bit of history. You may not have known about this. Built by two amazing young men. Next picture. Back in 1879, this is a map dated 1879, there were settlements in Utah, up and down the valley in Utah, and in Arizona. And the Grand Canyon in 1879, that whole area was about 300 miles of roadblock. They just could not, as tough and hardy as the pioneers were, it was a blockage. They could not get, I don't even say conveniently, just basically could hardly get from from Utah to Arizona. So next slide. Everybody knew about the Bright Angel Fault, and if you've been standing on the south rim ever, you know about the big split in the earth, big crack in the earth going down to the Colorado River and then up the south rim. Yeah, they knew about it, but to try to go through that fault line was impossible. A few miners did it. They had to hoist their donkeys at points and push the donkeys up and haul them up, but it was just an absolutely miserable trip. But they constantly, in those days, were looking for a way to get across the Grand Canyon from Utah to Arizona. Next slide. And this is a picture from that era. Gives you an idea of the rugged terrain that this is probably taken with a Kodak Brownie camera shortly after it came out. Next slide. It was up, two young men finally did it. And Francois Mathis, you can't imagine two young men more different. It's like they were from different planets, but they opened up the trail. Francois Mathis on the left was born to an aristocratic Dutch family. Got that? Raised in Amsterdam and grew up. His father was a principal in one of the big multinational Dutch corporations. Very wealthy, traveled through the capitals of Europe as a child, learned 6, 7 languages. And when he came to America at age 17, he had letters of introduction to the president of Yale and the president of MIT saying, this is a good kid, he's got plenty of money, why don't you let him go to your university? Now, Dave Rust, on the other hand, was, I use the word hardscrabble. He was from a hardscrabble Mormon family in central Utah, could hardly get to school for an education. His mother had to supplement his classes, and he spent a lot of his childhood herding sheep tending in the mountains in Utah, southern Utah. But both hardworking, capable young men, both born in the month of March 1874. So next slide, Robert. It was Mathis who was the first in the Grand Canyon. He was awarded a contract to make maps of the North Rim area. That's Mathis on the right, with all the equipment. And to do that in his day, which was being about 1902, he had to bring a pack train with probably a ton of equipment on a bunch of big pack animals to the North Rim, because there were no resources on the North Rim. And he had to bring everything with him, including the heavy, in those days, heavy equipment for surveying. So he had a pack train of up to 10, I believe it was 10 big animals, not donkeys, but horses and mules. Next slide. And later in life, and he did it, he went through the Bass Trail on the far west part of the canyon with his 10 horse and mule caravan. He said, he wrote in he was very proud of this. He wrote in his memoirs that some of the animals went into a frenzy when they had to swim across the Colorado River in those days and just about drowned the mule skinners in the process. But he did it. He got up to the North Rim, did his work with surveying, and then he brought them down the fault. He was the first one with large animals. Yes, others had done it and done it with donkeys, but he was the first one with large animals down through the North Kaibab Trail. Next slide. Then 2 years later, came Dave Rust, the hardscrabble Mormon kid. He, with some private funds, they hired him with work crews to basically go down Mathis's trail that he plotted out and expand it so large animals could go down the trail. That was their goal, and he did it. And those guys, you can get an idea from the picture of how hard they worked. Then he got to the next slide, got to the Colorado River. In those days, the Colorado River was not regulated, so it could be a wild animal of a river. And his job, this basically homeschooled kid from central Utah, his job was to make a way across the river. Next slide. So he consulted with miners. He got 700 pounds of woven steel cable across the river. He devised supports on each side of the river. He, again, consulting with mining people, he devised a trolley system, and according to them, he took the advice of other friends to build a basket, or a cage, they called it in those days, and it worked. Then came the time for the first official photograph that would circulate about this new way to cross the river. So here's these guys, and picture this with me. Here's these guys, they've been down in the canyon, working their hearts out, and hot, wet, they did it in the summer, by the way, working their hearts out, and what kind of a picture should we have? What kind of, Harvey Girls. On the South Rim is this big hotel called the El Tovar, and they've got young women there called Harvey Girls. Let's get a couple of Harvey Girls down here and be the first official ride across the river. Next slide. So they did. And the girls look pretty cool in this picture, but to go across the river, it wasn't just a straight line. You first dipped way down, close, it seemed like close to the river, and then they would haul you up to the other side. So the girls went from one side to the other. And I don't have their names in my head, but still, if you look it up in history, you can find their names. A couple of courageous young women. And I'm sure that young man was just pleased as punch to be sitting there with a couple of girls. Okay, next slide. This is the North Kaibab. Some of you will remember this. The upper level, you can see how they chopped out, by hook or by crook, chopped out the trail and chopped out the overhanging cliffs so that pack animals or hikers with big backpacks could go down it. Next slide. That's me, earlier version of me in 1988 with my cousin Lee. They chopped out a tunnel, a 20-foot tunnel out of the rock. Next slide. And if this waterfall, you go past the Ribbon Falls, and it just beyond beautiful. It's just another sight to see along the North Kaibab Trail. If this waterfall, I always say we're in Illinois or Iowa, it would be the tourist mecca, the tourist draw of the whole state. They would have it on license plates. They would have it on the state letterhead. But here it's just another gorgeous thing to see along the trail. Next slide. Then the trail goes down through dark cliffs, kind of pinched cliffs, and then opens up. Next slide, Robert. And then it opens up into, in this case, that's our campsite in the Bright Angel Campground. Look at that scenery beyond the campground with the sun shining on it. If any of you are familiar with the painter Maxfield Parrish, that's a Maxfield Parrish painting all the way. Next slide. Okay, Tanner Trail. In many, in some senses, my favorite trail. I'm going to do a little bit of history here too. I'll try to keep it quick, and I'll start at the bottom of the trail and work. The Tanner Trail is just loaded with history coming up the trail. Okay, next slide. At the bottom are the split twig figurines, carbon dated to about 4,000 years. They're found in the vicinity of the base of the Tanner Trail. You go up a little further, next slide. Well, you stay at the bottom, actually. The ancestral Puebloan people lived down there, right on deltas along the Colorado River. Next slide. This is the place, one of the places they lived. This is a huge archaeology site. It's called Unkar Delta, behind me in the picture there. The archaeologists have been all over that site. The native people had terraces. They had irrigation systems. Next slide. I read the corn, squash, and beans. I read the archaeology report. It was about a 400-page book. No drawings, no sketches. And I was so curious about what this must have looked like that I did my own sketch, for better or worse. But this is reading the book and trying to put a representation of Unkar Delta. The structure to the left is, according to the archaeologists, a kiva. Got a couple of young men probably coming down from the higher altitudes with a deer. Rather small dwellings, probably useful mainly in bad weather and at night. And in this case, they probably had patio walls around their places. Next slide, Robert. Coronado expedition. Cardenas and his soldiers came through in the year 1540, basically said, worthless land. Sent a couple of scouts down. They didn't see much. He wrote in his report, everybody else from Spain, just stay out of here, stay away, there's nothing down here. And for 200 years, that was the word about the Grand Canyon. And Anglos didn't visit, basically. Next slide. However, the horse thieves came through in the mid-1800s. Stealing horses in Utah, they found a way through the Grand Canyon from the north with stolen horses, forded the Colorado River near the base of the Tanner Trail, and then came up the Tanner Trail about halfway up, where they would pause and set up camp to alter the horses' brands with what they call a running iron. Some of you, I know, are ranchers that know what that is. And wait for the brands, the scabs to heal up and so forth. Then they go to California, to Arizona and sell the horses. So coming up the Tanner, I'm so excited about this story that I'm fumbling my words here. Coming up the Tanner Trail, next slide, Robert. A friend and I went poking around at a good halfway camp, and sure enough, old rusted tin cans. The thing with a lot of patina on it is an old cowboy, what I would call a cowboy coffee pot, easily more than 100 years old. I looked up to see if indeed they had canned goods in the mid-1800s, and yes, they did. Canned fruit, canned vegetables. They even had canned milk in the mid-1800s. So having a lot of cans, that kind of fit what you would expect. I don't know if the rangers are ready to call it a cowboy camp yet, but the trail did have the nickname Horse Thief Trail for quite a while. Okay, a little higher. Next slide, Robert. Miners in the late 1800s brought up. Now listen to what they were going into the ground to dig up. Picture them in the tunnels, bringing out donkeys or mules full of high-grade ore. Copper, as you would expect. This is coming up the Tanner Trail. Silver, yeah. A little bit of gold. Asbestos. Now, think of all the ramifications of that. So, next slide. Then you get to the 1932 construction of the Watchtower. Many of you have seen that on the east. It's become the iconic structure on the east side, made by a female architect who was the first nationally famous architect. By the way, Fred and Mary Heinrichs used to go here. Mary knew Mary Coulter real well, and in retirement, Mary's father lived close to Mary Coulter. Next slide. 1956, the worst civilian aircraft disaster in history occurred over the Tanner Trail. 2 big passenger planes, each pilot trying to give the passengers a wonderful view of the canyon, hit each other in their blind spots and went down at a high rate of speed. 128 people killed, and one of the results was the formation of the FAA, Federal Aeronautics Administration. And in the old days, not the modern era, there were pilots. I know there's a couple Air Force people here. There were pilots, one of them might be sitting here, who actually flew their jet aircraft below the rim of the Grand Canyon and out again. They don't do that anymore, but I'll leave it at that. Maybe you'll ask a question afterwards who that would be. Next, I don't know if he wants to be recognized or not. And just to end on a good note, excuse the pun, we're down at our last day on the Tanner, and they had a music festival up on the rim, and we could hear every note 3,000 feet down below. And we were clapping and calling for an encore. They couldn't hear us, but we came. That was our last night in the canyon on the Tanner Trail with a musical interlude. Next slide. Deer Creek Trail. I've got two and then a short trail left. Deer Creek Trail. Next slide, Robert. A wonderful trail, but a beast to get to. You start getting to it from Jacob Lake on the north rim, and then you go through National Forest Service roads for about 3 hours, 2-track roads, and then you get to the trailhead, and you're ready for your hike down the Deer Creek Trail. Next slide. All the while watched by the little Abert squirrels sitting in the trees, and deer, just a real wildlife zone. Next slide. When my buddies and I went down this one, and this is a word to the wise, they each had a couple of strong young sons, so we were very happy to let the sons do the heavy lifting. Next slide. Their version, the Deer Creek version of the Tonto Trail, is not called the Tonto. In that section of the Grand Canyon, it's called the Esplanade. It's about as wide as the Tonto, and these incredible sandstone formations. Looks like a soft ice cream dispenser at a Dairy Queen, glopped out a bunch of ice cream, and then it petrified hard. A bunch of these things are 8, 10, 12 feet tall, all across the Esplanade. Well, we were a little short of water. Next, not too bad, but we were marshaling our water very carefully. And one of the young guys climbed on top of on that part of the canyon, they call them hoodoos. And we were the older guys were fixing supper, and one of the young guys went up, and then he hollered down from the top of a hoodoo, "Hey, water up here." And we thought he was kidding, but no, he wasn't. Potholes full of wonderful water, and little tadpoles. I don't know how they got up to the top of those hoodoos, but little tadpoles. So we went up with our handy-dandy water purifiers. There's Louis' water purifier at work. And we toasted each other and clinked glasses and everything, drinking hoodoo water that night. Next slide. The Deer Creek Trail has one of the best slot canyons anywhere. It's absolutely one of the best in the Grand Canyon, one of 2 really good ones. But I consider it to rank up with the South Utah slot canyons. The reason being, because these guys were with me on one, the reason being it's kind of a flat walk. You don't have to butt scoot down and clamber up boulders in the bottom of a slot canyon, of this particular slot canyon. Next slide, Robert. And then you get to the bottom, and then you're just knocked out by this Deer Creek Falls that we've already talked about. It's the water never ends. It comes out of the aquifer and creates its own climate zone at the bottom of the falls, as you all know, with the mist. Next slide. Okay, Cave of the Domes with Dan Collins. That's my timer, okay? That's not what it sounds like. Okay, that means I'm going to start wrapping it up quickly. Cave of the Domes with Dan, next slide. Deep in the canyon, we had permits for it. This is Dan on the edge of the cliff. You kind of white knuckle it going down the edge of the cliff. Next slide, to the opening of the cave, which is, like a lot of caves, very small. Next slide. Dan took upon himself the responsibility of the string that would go deep into the cave. And if all 6 of our flashlights, we had 6 between us, if all 6 of our flashlights burned out or dropped or something, we still had the string to get back to the entrance. So I was expecting Dan to bring a ball of string like that, or maybe twine, or maybe small diameter rope to get out of the cave. But no, Dan brought fishing line. Monofilament, clear fishing line. And he assured me, Dave, it's high-test fishing line. It's okay. So here we go into the cave. Robert, Dan signing the guest registry. Next slide. And as we went into the cave, here's these 100-year-old signatures, probably with grease pencil on the walls of the cave. And these are historic names. I don't have time to talk about them all, but I could talk for 20 minutes just on the cave, on the names that are imprinted on the wall here from far more than 100 years ago. Next slide. The domes themselves, looking up, were like inverted teacups or coffee cups with stripes in them. Aptly named, Cave of the Domes is a good name for it. Next slide. So we got deep in the cave, and as those of you who've been in a cave, it's no fun unless you turn off all your light sources, right? And you want to feel what the darkness is like. Yeah, well, I'm a little squeamish anyway, but it's like a black blanket all over you. So we're in the deep in the cave, as far back as we were going to go. We butt scooted up and down and climbed and went down passageways. And so let's turn off our lights. Okay. Whoa, that was darkness. And then my comment to Dan, next slide, Robert. Dan, just how strong is that fishing line? Next slide. And best ever hike, those of you who are grandparents, just 3 slides on this hike. This was last year, down the Bright Angel Trail. Next slide, with my son-in-law, Patrick Strait, and my grandson, Wyatt. Youngest, at age 13, the youngest hiker I'd ever taken down on a multi-day hike. Next slide. So we got down to the bottom. We overnighted. We took 2 days to get down. Then we overnighted in the Bright Angel camp. And Wyatt was sitting there in the camp looking up. He'd just been down the whole thing. He was doing pretty good. And he said, you know, Pop, I'd like to try to hike out the whole way, all at once, not camp halfway up. Noble thought, young Wyatt. The 2 older guys, and this old guy, age 72 or whatever I was then, look at each other and, well, we thought we'd give it a try, and we did it. Wyatt led the way. Next slide. And he was happy with the hike. We came out at 10 o'clock at night using our headlamps, but it was a lot of fun. And Wyatt and I were on the Grand Canyon, at the canyon a couple months ago, and then Wyatt's last comment was, you know, Pop, I'd like to try this again sometime. So, you know, my heart just totally warmed. Okay, that's the last one of this part of the show, and now I'll wrap it up. Robert, I told a number of people I was going to give encouragement to those of you who are writing books, and we have some authors here. And some of you are assembling your memoirs other ways, through 3-ring binders or whatever the method. Keep doing that. Okay, leaving a legacy is so important for folks like us, for the next generations. Next slide. And for me, it's my motto I want to impart to the next generations. In regard to the land, we should act as if we're caretakers, not owners. Next slide. And I take that very seriously. I can't go to the Grand Canyon to volunteer, so the Grand Canyon Conservancy is the educational arm of the canyon. Grand Canyon Trust is the protective arm of the National Park Service, separate entity, and the Sierra Club has a Grand Canyon chapter, which also has a lobbyist in Phoenix. So I can't be up there to help with all the cleanup, but I can support these organizations. Next slide. Now, will our great-grandchildren read words on paper? Maybe. I'm hoping they do. I'm kind of banking on it, but you never know. So next slide. If you know of somebody in your group, in your association, in your club, hiking partners, if you know of somebody who's working on a legacy, who's working on a book, something for the next generations, or I'll embarrass Bill Moberg. Bill has got a YouTube, a wonderful guy, wonderful YouTube site, Mountain Guy Adventures. And Bill is working his heart out to be a good influencer on mainly national parks, right, Bill? And he's got all these wonderful posts just coming up, and you can subscribe to Bill's posts and get them in your email. And one of his posts went viral, 2 million hits on one of Bill. He's sitting right here in the room. So I'd like to give you hope. If Bill can do it, so can the rest. Next slide. And it may, if not words on paper, maybe you take video, store it, file it carefully. Pictures, YouTube type posts, podcast, website, maybe a blog of some kind. Next slide. So, okay, I'm getting close to the end. I will say one thing. This is my website. It's called Secrets of the Grand Canyon, and it's at grandcanyontrails.wordpress. It's free. It isn't. I don't have to pay anything. They want to put advertising on it, but I have not found the advertising to be not too offensive. Once in a while, they throw in a zinger of a woman in a bathing suit or something, but other than that, not too bad. And I tell people, I introduce myself and my book and my website. Now, here's what I'd like to leave with those of you who are writing. Think seriously about a website, a platform, because a big book publisher will come to you, and Debbie Thomas in the back row has found this out too. We had a long correspondence about it. You think you've got the best book in the world, you bring your manuscript to the book publisher, here's my baby, can you publish it? And then they'll look it over. Even if you got the best manuscript in the world, they'll look at you and say, well, what's your platform? And by that they mean how many people subscribe to your Facebook page, how many people subscribe to your YouTube presence. And Bill, I believe you're over several hundred now, right? Couple? Yeah, 3,000? So if you have any questions about how to do it, not me, this is the guy. Or I know, I'm so excited about that, I lost my train of thought. It's just as well, we got to wrap this up. Next slide. So I send out weekly posts, and you can recognize some of the visuals in the weekly posts. And that's building up my platform so that next time I unload my precious manuscript to a book publisher, I'm trying to get a big book publisher in New York or somewhere, I can say, yeah, I got a platform. And the rest of you in the audience, if somebody you know is trying to do that, don't look at them as egocentric or self-centered. Help them out. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe, and you can always unsubscribe if you don't like it. But it really helps the people that are trying to be a good influencer. Okay, next slide. So having said all that, I'm not hawking my books. I don't want to do that. But they are available in the back 3 ways. Cash for $26.95, or if you don't, you can, it's the honor system. You can bring a book home if you don't have the cash. You can pay by Apple Pay, Venmo, or PayPal. Just give me your email address, or check in the mail is good too. You can get my address. So that's, next slide, Robert. Yeah, that wraps up, and thank you all for coming out. I hope it's been mildly entertaining. I hope you leave with some good thoughts. And those of you interested in communicating with the next generations, do so. You've got a lot to share with them. So, thank you, Jim. I'll set my obnoxious timer here for about 5 minutes. And are there any questions? Yes. Oh. Yeah. Okay, I'll answer it. Yeah, so there we are, dead of night, sleeping in the dark. I'm not being facetious, hoping and praying that we'd find water the next morning. So Tobin couldn't ambulate very well. His knee was such a problem. So Patrick and I loaded up all our canteens, and we went it was about a little more than a quarter mile, half a mile, one way and then the other, and we found it. So we loaded up our canteens. It took us about an hour and a half to go there and come back. And we were whooping it up and hollering so that Tobin back in our tents could hear us, and he couldn't hear us. So that must have been the longest hour and a half of Tobin's life, waiting to get that water. But we came walking in with all our canteens full of water. And the next day, the rest of the hike, we were at a good water source the next night. Then we went down to the Colorado River, plenty of water there, of course, back up to our good water source. And there's a whole story about that, which I can't get into. But packed a ton of water to come out slowly. Tobin's knee actually did pretty good. Oh, I'll leave you with this comment. I often tell my hikers this. If your knee goes out going down into a canyon on a canyon hike, if you have a knee trouble, the upward hike will often be a whole different kind of hike. And so many times in my groups I saw this. A bad knee going down was not a problem coming up. In fact, my own wife, that was her situation. I not guarantee every time, but Tobin got out okay, and we're just so happy about that. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'll get this one and then I'll get Bill. Rim to rim, yeah, a couple of times. 4 day, I don't run it, like my niece. My niece has run it twice, rim to rim to rim. So, and the last time they did it from the Bright Angel Trailhead, so it was a 52-mile run, and she and my nephew did it in 17 hours. That was just a couple months ago. She's done it twice now. That whole family is super athletes. I take 4 days to do it. But I did go down with the guy who was a barefoot hiker. And when he started on the North Rim, and it would be rim to rim, 34 miles, I did not think there was any way under the sun that this guy could do it. He had little pieces of like naga hide from a piece of furniture. It was about as thick as the letter M in a manuscript. And he had those on his feet, but he did it. And he explained, it's a long story, but he was a very conscientious barefoot hiker. And he went rim to rim barefoot. Never complained once, never had a problem. I don't aspire to do that, but he had a long lecture for me about how boot makers are selling us a bill of goods, so we always have to depend on their boots. We have to have thick-soled boots, but the natural human foot doesn't need those thick-soled boots. And I'm thinking, yeah, but I do. Maybe one more question? Oh, yeah, Bill.
I've spent many nights with Dave in the Grand Canyon. He's the most thorough person I've ever met, planning hikes and stuff. Just wanted to say all the great memories I had with hiking with Dave.
Oh, thank you.
Tell him how many nights you spent below the rim.
I'm getting around 100. I need to 100 nights. What's that? Question. A word of thanks from a guy who says thank you. That really counts. And how many nights have I spent below the rim? And often backpackers, that's the thing they talk about, when you get together. Yeah, it's about 100 nights for me now. And each night has its own story. It's not like going to a motel for a night. Each night has its own story, as you see in my book. Yes, Dave.
David has a question for you.
This is Dave Phillips, former scoutmaster from Upper Michigan, Charlevoix, Michigan. Yes, Dave.
Anyway, I brought an award because I have your book. I've been to every library around the state of Arizona, and this guy does an excellent presentation, let me tell you. From library to library, this is one of his best presentations, and I just wanted to give you a naturalist award. It's a tree. It says to Double D, that would be Dave DeGroot, a professional hiker with a lot of great imagination. And the reason I'm giving you this tree is because it starts with a seed, and it starts with a seed and a root. And you've got a great root, growing great seeds every time you present your presentation. The fact that a tree has a bud, well, it might have a butt too. Anyway.
Thank you, Dave.
But, and I know you have, but anyway, the bud is often budding in your presentations, and today it finally is blooming here at Grace. I thank you, and just for practical purposes, there's a seed for you to spread it 4 times at least minimally, because there's 4 seeds in it. Congratulations and thanks.
Thank you, Dave. A word of gratitude. Thank you, Dave. And I'll close on this note. One more question, then I'll close on. I'll hold them.
Strange English. But my question to you is, what drives you to so many years to hike there in Grand Canyon? Is this the beauty of the nature, beauty of this place, or you want to prove yourself the power of your body?
The question is, what drives me? Is it the beauty? Is it just using my youth and vigor, which I don't have anymore? But what drove me? Well, something went on in my brain when I was a kid. And those of you who have grandchildren, you know, the times you spend camping with them, the time you take them to the zoo, maybe working on the lawn, maybe looking at a bug on a tree. I'm a docent at Madera Canyon also, taking kids through Madera Canyon, and there's so much to see out in creation that, and you can imprint this on impressionable young minds so much better than having them sit there working their iPhones or watching TV or something like that. So that's it. And my last story, and then I'll put the mic down and turn it off. If you want to know, if you want to meet somebody who cooked the world's largest cherry pie, he was in the Guinness Book of World Records. This is Dave from Charlevoix, Michigan. Baked the world's largest cherry pie and got in the Guinness Book of World Records in northern Michigan. How many pounds did it weigh, Dave?
It weighed 7 1/4 ton.
7 1/4 ton cherry pie. So ask him. We got to wrap this up, but ask Dave about his cherry pie when you. True story. Okay, thanks for coming out.